Asian parenting is arguably the most well-known parenting style in the world for a lot of wrong reasons. Like a lot of maybe Western, especially Western countries or Western parents, they would accuse the Asian parenting style of being too violent, too cruel. There are a lot of like negative stereotypes around it. So I'm just wondering, from your point of view, do you think these stereotypes are true?
As with any stereotype, there's always nuance. It is not going to be 100% true. I do think that people don't see enough the goodness of Asian parenting.
Welcome to Proudly Asian, a podcast series that tells bold and proud stories of Asians by Asians. My name is Isabel, your podcast host, and I'm here to find stories that challenge biases we face every day. There's never just one way to look at Asians. This podcast will take you through a deep dive into the life stories, struggles, and triumphs of young Asians around the world. On today's episode, we have Kelly Tay, a Singaporean parenting coach who is also the founder of Juicy Parenting. Formerly a journalist and Fulbright scholar, Kelly joins us to talk about how to break toxic Asian parenting cycles and why she thinks Asian parenting needs a reboot.
Welcome back to Proudly Asian, everyone. Now, for this episode, as you have heard in the intro, we're going to chat about a topic that would often leave us speechless. But still, there's a lot to be said about it. So without further ado, let's get cracking with it, shall we? So let's bring in our guest, Kelly, who is joining us from Canada currently. Kelly, welcome to Proudly Asian. How are you?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm good. I'm usually based in Singapore, but right now I'm in Canada doing daughter-in-law duties, visiting my in-laws. So that's where I am right now.
Lovely. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Canada while you're on your holiday. And of course, for us to chat about all things parenting or Asian parenting, it's definitely a very difficult topic because for a lot of our listeners, they might be parents to be or they are parents to young children. So they would definitely be curious to know about, all things parenting. Any smart tips, any advice that you have for them. But before we get started with it, I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit more about your background. Who are you? What are you? And where did you grow up, Kelly?
Sure. So my name is Kelly. I am from Singapore. I was born and raised in Singapore. And in terms of what am I love that question. Like, what are you exactly? So in terms of what I am, if you look at my identity card in Singapore, it says Chinese. But technically, I'm Peranakan, which is a mix between Malay and Chinese. It's like this heritage that is really, really blended. So technically, I'm Peranakan, but on my identity card, it says Chinese. The second language I speak is Mandarin. That's what's taught in school. If your race on your card says Chinese, you learn Mandarin. So that's what I grew up learning. But my parents, they speak English, Malay. My mom speaks Cantonese. So it's really quite a blend, actually, in terms of like, what am I exactly?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, what was it like growing up in Singapore for you? Like, are there many different types of Chinese in Singapore? And would they kind of be looking at each other also, oh, you're our kind of Chinese, or you're not my kind of Chinese? Are there conversations going on like that?
Not really. I think that growing up in Singapore, it's kind of like the conversation is shaped around how our national policy is, which is we have technically 4 different races on paper. So it's Chinese, Malay, Indian, and then other. So if you don't belong in those 3 categories, you are other. And so I don't think anyone's really going like, oh, you are this kind of Chinese, you are that kind of Chinese. I think it's just, okay, which bucket do you belong to? And then we're all kids. But I also think like I have the privilege of saying that because in Singapore, Chinese people are the majority. And so I was part of the majority. And I think that never really occurred to me until I studied overseas for exchange programs and summer schools when I went to Western countries. And I was like, oh, now I'm in the minority. Like, this is what, excuse me, this is what it feels like. And I think that was quite interesting for me. Like, I never really noticed that until I kind of moved out of the country. But growing up in Singapore, I didn't feel that. It was just like, okay, I'm just Chinese, I'm just part of the majority. This is just what it is. So yeah, I don't think there's any kind of like segmenting, like, oh, you are this kind of Chinese or you're not. It's only as I grew older, I started to realize, oh, my identity card says Chinese, but technically on both sides of my parents were Peranakan, which is quite different.
Since we're talking about parenting styles in this episode, I'm also wondering like what kind of parenting style that your parents had.
Yeah. So with my parents, I would say in general, they were actually quite countercultural for their time. You know, Asian families, it's often like study hard, do the subjects that matter, like go be a doctor, go be a lawyer, go do the things that are important, and then we're all good. But my parents were actually quite happy to let me experiment and go with my interests, which is quite countercultural, right? So, like in university, I studied English literature, like that's what I majored in. And I think for a lot of Asian parents, it's kind of like, no, that's such a useless subject. Please don't study that. But for my parents, it was very much like, yeah, go do what you love, go do what you believe in. And so I'm like eternally grateful for that because I think it really shaped how I approach learning because I studied things that I love to learn. And so for me, learning wasn't a chore, like school, university, writing papers, it wasn't a chore. And I think I'm really grateful for them for saying, no, we're not going to do the typical Asian parent thing. Go and do what you're interested in. So I think that way they were very countercultural. Also, they kind of let me just explore and do things that, again, didn't seem to have much utility at the time and maybe to other parents would seem very frivolous. So, for example, like when I was in university, I went to the National University of Singapore, but if you look at the time I actually spent in Singapore, it was like maybe half of my 4-year degree because most of that time I was applying for overseas things and like going to like summer schools, and I took a semester off school. Like I just paused my degree and went to go work in a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. And I remember at the time, a lot of my friends were like, why would you do that? Like, that is just so useless. Like, just graduate, get a job, you know? And my parents were very much supportive. They were like, yeah, okay, go do it. Like, my agreement was like, I'll get the funding, I'll get the scholarships, I'll go do it. It won't cost more money, I'll just be out. And my parents, to their everlasting credit, were never like, why do you want to do these things? It's not useful. Go and get a real job. You know, like they were very, very supportive. So I think on those two counts, like very, very different from the norm. And at the same time, they were quite similar to the norm in terms of their disciplinary approach. So I wouldn't say they were like super harsh. Like in Asian families, sometimes you'll hear parents threatening to kick their kids out of the house or like really doing it, like closing the door and like you wait outside. My parents were never that harsh. They did, however, cane me. I don't know in Hong Kong, do people cane people? Do you know what a cane is?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like that long, bendy, like rattan stick. So I did get caned as a kid, probably not as much as my brother because I'm younger. But I did get caned as a kid. I think also like emotionally, Asian parents generally are quite emotionally avoidant. They don't really connect with their kids. So I think in that ways they were quite typical too and quite products of their time. So I think growing up, I had a mix of like my parents being very countercultural in many ways and then also being quite typical in other ways. And every time I say this to fellow Asian people, they're kind of like, you're speaking ill of your parents. How could you? It's like the worst sin to commit, right? Like, how could you even critique your parents? And I guess, like, I always say that it's okay to acknowledge that two different things, seemingly opposing things, can be true at the same time, right? Like, I could have had a very happy childhood and still acknowledge that I did have some hurts in my childhood as well, right? And I can also say that my parents did use quite violent and outdated parenting methods. And at the same time, I don't question their love for me. You know, I think those two things, these two different, seemingly different buckets can exist at the same time. And I mean, I've spoken about it with my parents before, and I do acknowledge that, you know, they were doing what they knew best at the time. Um, Honestly, parenting coaches like me, we didn't exist back then. There wasn't so much access to this kind of information. And I think in a lot of ways, I'm also very clear on acknowledging my parents did very many things very differently from how their parents did things in the past. So they've already kind of gone through a whole leap of cycle breaking in their own ways, right? Being countercultural in many different ways, not being as harsh as their parents were to them. And then now in my generation, I'm kind of taking that forward. And then I hope that in my kids' generation, they take that forward. So that in every generation, there's this improvement rather than stasis. And so I guess for any Asian people listening, thinking like, Kelly, how could you say these things about your parents? I think I would encourage everyone to just realize that two things can be true. Two seemingly opposing things can be true, and it's okay to acknowledge that. And it's, in fact, the only way we can progress, right? If we don't acknowledge what wasn't so good before, then how are we going to make a difference going forward? So, anyway, that was a long answer. That was how I was raised. That was what my parents were like.
Absolutely. I completely agree with your point about there are always, like good things and bad things that comes with our childhood, or like how our parents, like our parents are allowed to make mistakes because
Yes.
like they are human. And I mean, sometimes people might actually complain about their parents being like, oh, I can't believe, my parents did this or that. But what they might kind of like fail to understand or realize is that they are just trying their best. And if it's the first child, it's also the first time parenting a child as well. They are also
Yes.
learning. Everything is new to them. And the only kind of like resources or examples they had, while being a new parent was their parents, basically like our
Yes.
grandparents, right? So if our
100%.
grandparents never show them like anything different, like from the old ways, then that's unfortunately what they are going to continue, because that's the example that they had growing up. But I also really love how you mentioned that it is okay for us to also criticize our parents, because like from some previous mental health day episodes that we had on Proudly Asian, I also mentioned how like a long time ago, I think as a teenager, I saw a counselor myself about maybe my relationship with my mom, because our relationship was quite turbulent. And I was telling my counselor, saying that, oh, I'm really sad because I don't think I can be angry at my mom, because that's just how, like mother-daughter relationships work. Like the daughter is never supposed to be angry at the parent. But my counselor just asked me something that kind of like changed everything about my life. She just said, why can't you be angry at your parents? And I was like, whoa. That was kind of the moment that changed my life. I was like, wow, I was allowed to be angry at my family members, my parents. So when you talked about that, it kind of like reminded me of that moment again.
I love that. I actually got chills like listening to you say it, because I can understand what a revolutionary idea it can be for an Asian kid to suddenly hear, wait, why can't you be angry? Right? Because for
Exactly.
so long we're taught to just, like you said, that's just the dynamic. That's just what we do. We repress it. We're not allowed to show it. It's not okay. It makes us an unfilial child if we are. And yet, actually, the truth is quite different. And I think it's okay to say, there were hurts. I am upset about these things. And I still love my parents, right?
Yeah.
And I can still acknowledge they did so much. I don't think they have to necessarily be connected with a but, like a warring statement. It's okay to have both exist at the same time. So I actually got chills hearing you say
Absolutely.
it, because
I
I'm like,
know.
I can see
Me
how that would
too.
have been like, whoa, you too? Yeah, still.
Yes. Yeah, because like I mean, like every time I think back on that moment, I still kind of feel like, I don't know, it's like I still can't just talk about it with no emotion stirring up
Yeah.
within me. Yeah.
Yeah.
But now let's move on to a slightly more fun question, Kelly.
Okay.
I honestly don't know if this is an Asian parents thing, but then like growing up, I've heard a lot of my Asian friends that they would have their parents telling them white lies just to get them to do or eat what they want wanted them to either do, right? I mean, like, for example, for myself, one example that I remember is that, like, my mom would always tell me that fish was bird meat because as a kid, for some reason, I really hated fish. And in order to get me to eat fish, she was saying, like, you're eating bird. And then for some reason, that idea was a little bit more appealing for me, which I have no idea why. So I'm just wondering if growing up you had any white lies coming from your parents.
Wait a minute. So you did buy it and you did eat it because you thought it was bird meat?
Yes. And I still remember as like a 3 or 4 year old, I was having all these like images in my head about like, oh, how would people catch birds on the streets? Like, just how? Like, do they just catch them with a net or something? And I think I did not realize it was a lie until I was well into 10 years old or something.
I love it. I love it. These things really stick. It's true.
I know.
For me, it's funny though, because like you're given an example about food, and my example is about food too. And I think it's very common to have Asian parents kind of tell white lies or manipulate and coerce around food, right? Because it's such an expression of love, like you have to eat.
Yeah.
Anyway, for me, it was okay. Honestly, my parents didn't really do stuff like that to their credit, but I did get a lot of it from like my elders. Like if I would go to their house, like we would have dinner at my great grandma's every Saturday growing up. And I do remember elders telling me that if I didn't finish what was on my plate, the number of like grains of rice on my plate would mirror my husband's face in the future in terms of like pock marks that they would have.
No.
Yeah, it was a thing. And
Oh my
not
God.
true, by the way. My husband does not. And I definitely left a lot of grains of rice on my plate growing up. But yeah, that was
Busted.
definitely one thing I heard.
Now, all the younger Asians, they will never fall for this. Or like,
I don't know. You don't think so?
yeah, I mean, well, actually, you're right. A lot of them actually are related to food. For example, like, oh, when you're eating fruits or like watermelons, if you swallow the seeds, they said there will be a plant growing out of your head or something like that.
I got that too. Yeah.
And you would believe them. And then, yeah, I mean, I made the conscious effort of like spitting out all the seeds.
Even now, still?
Oh no, not now.
Okay.
Now. But maybe like out of habits.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can see
so
that.
I mean, that's always funny when you think back on all those like ridiculous white lies that the elders and the parents tell us. So for our listeners, if you actually grew up with these white lies, do come forward with some of the white lies that you grew up with. The more ridiculous, the more welcome. So going back to your journey becoming a parenting coach, right? You mentioned to me off air that you used to be a journalist and now you're a parenting coach. So why the switch?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a windy path. So I was a financial journalist for many years. I was at the Business Times in Singapore and I covered the Singapore economy and government policy. And I loved it. I genuinely loved my job. I switched out of that industry, honestly, because at some point, the irregular hours and the not so great pay was something that was like, I can't keep doing this. So I remember, do you have time for a story?
Of course, always.
Okay, so I remember I was engaged at the time, then fiance, now husband. And, you know, as a journalist, you know this, you work the job. You know that when something comes in, you drop everything. If it's your beat, you drop everything, you cover it because there can't be a hole in the next day's paper, right? Like you have to cover the story. Doesn't matter what you have planned, you're covering the story. And I remember there was this time, it was this pivotal moment for me where, so I covered the Singapore economy and government policy. So anytime the Prime Minister said something, generally that would be something for me to cover. And so it was, you know, a weeknight, it was late. The Prime Minister said something and it was now my business to cover it. Except that night, my husband, well, then fiance, had bought tickets to one of his favorite artists. And it was playing at this fancy theater at the Esplanade, like the fanciest theater in Singapore. And I couldn't make it, right? Because this thing came in. And so he went to the thing alone. And I rushed. I like typed out as fast as I could. I filed the story. I made it all the way down. And when I got there, the guy was on not even his last song, he was on his encore piece. Like the whole thing was done. He was on his encore piece. And I remember running into the, like finding the row and sitting down next to him and like saying hi and like putting my hand on his lap. And he just stared straight forward. He did not say anything. He did not say hi. He just stared straight forward. And anyone who knows my husband in real life knows he is honestly like the most kind, the most patient person. And so for him to be like, dude, I'm not even talking to you right now, like that was a big moment. And I had never seen him that cross really. And I remember thinking at the time, so I was newly engaged, and I remember thinking, I can't go into a marriage like this. I can't go into a new marriage kind of dropping things at the last minute. At this point, it had been 6 years of me doing this job, 6 years of me dropping things at the last minute and leaving him alone to do the thing. And that's fine, that's well and good when you're dating. But I felt that I was moving into a new phase of life. And I was like, I don't want this to be how I start a marriage. And at the time, no kids. But I also thought in the future, whatever future kids I have, I don't really want to be bailing on them at the last minute because of my job. And I say this knowing that many people do this with their jobs, right? Like if you're a journalist, you do this. If you're a doctor, you do this. If you're a politician, you do this. And I think it's totally great if someone is able to make peace with that for themselves. But for me, I couldn't reconcile it. And so I was like, it's time to move on from this industry. And it was really hard because I loved the job. Like I loved the things I covered. I loved the newsroom, the people I worked with. I had great editors. I loved the people I got to interview, really brilliant people that you get access to that you ordinarily wouldn't. And so it was hard for me to leave the industry. I still try to have a foot in the door. I still write things in the papers nowadays, but from a point of view as a parenting coach. So I write commentaries about Asian parenting, but I no longer do the journalism type thing. So that was hard. So that was really the reason why I moved out. And I didn't go straight into owning my business. I worked at a bank for a few years. I was basically the chief editor of any publication that went out to like high net worth clients in the private bank. I would be the one to like oversee that content and make sure it's readable, it's jargon free, all that kind of things. So I did that for a few years. And then I actually quit that job after I had my first kid, because I genuinely loved motherhood so much. I wanted to be with my daughter. And I was like, I don't see how I can do both at the same time, at least in that phase of life. And so I was like, okay, I'm just quitting my corporate career. I honestly thought I would like focus on like just going back to, I used to volunteer a lot. I thought I would go back to volunteering and just really focus on my child. And then 2 years later, I ended up starting my business. So everything's kind of like a windy path from journalism to banking. And then after that, to not working. And well, I worked all the time with my daughter, but not being paid. And then now starting my own business. So it was quite a windy journey. And it wasn't something that was kind of like, oh, I'm leaving and I'm going to do this next. It was kind of quite organic, just based on what was happening in my life at the time. And then I kept moving on.
Wow. I mean, I gotta say, it really hit me when you mentioned, the impact of having a journalism job on your life, and also people around you. And I also could resonate with the point when you talked about how it was hard to leave your journalism job. It almost felt like a breakup with a first lover or something. Right?
Yes. It's true.
Yeah. And I mean, like, obviously, somehow you mentioned you did not plan all of these. Somehow it just happened the way that it did. But of all the maybe like businesses, why specifically parent coaching?
Yeah. Honestly, if you rewound like 5 years, I could not have predicted this. Like, it's not like I was just like, one day I'm going to own my business, I'm going to teach parents. Like, no. It all also actually the idea of my business was quite organic too. So when I became a parent, I realized that I didn't know how to parent. So it just struck me as really odd that we go to school to learn how to do, I don't know, to learn to be a specialist in some subject, right? We go for professional training to be really good at some specialist job. We go to driving school to learn how to drive a car. But like to raise a human being, the most important job we'll ever had, like such a huge responsibility, we get no training on. And when I became a mother, I realized, holy crap, like that's not good. I don't like that. I don't really know how to do this well. apart from what was modeled for me before, like you said earlier, right? The only example, the only knowledge we have of parenting is what we saw our parents do, which was based on what they saw their parents do, and so on and so forth. And I remember at the time thinking, like looking at my baby and being like, gosh, you are so wonderful and perfect, and I'm going to mess you up in so many ways. And let's try and educate myself. So hopefully I mess you up less than I would otherwise. And I found myself really, despite knowing in my head, I don't want to hit my kids, I don't want to be really harsh, I found it hard because that was my blueprint. That was what I had known. And so I put my journalist hat on, went on this crazy deep research, like crawling and like finding anything I could find, like academic research papers. I took courses, some professional level courses, and on various topics, not just like discipline, but everything, like how the brain develops, gross motor development, how to introduce foods. Like I did all these courses. And what I started realizing was like, wow, there actually is a way to parent well. It is not, some people will say like, oh, do what works for you. Like, no, objectively, there is a way to parent well. And it looks quite different from conventional Asian parenting. And so I started learning this stuff, and I was like, whoa, the things that resonated was seeing your child as a whole person, even a baby from birth, seeing them as just not like an adult in training or human being in training. They're a human being from birth, and we can respect them and the fact that they are their own unique person from the very beginning. And even when they start talking, like, kids throw tantrums and people are like, "Ah, whatever, crazy kid, like, you don't know what's good for you, I'll do it." But actually, the courses I was taking were teaching me that actually, when kids are tantruming, they're communicating something because they are a person, they have a point of view. They deserve to be listened to. Their opinion deserves to be respected. It doesn't mean, sure, get ice cream for breakfast. You're still a parent, you're still responsible. However, it's important as well to understand that when they are whining and screaming and tantruming about not getting ice cream for breakfast, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just how they're communicating. And then how do we teach them to communicate in a more appropriate way? And so learning this stuff, I was just like, whoa, this is so different from how I was raised. I really, really want to do this. And so I started practicing it in my daily life with my kid. And at the time, she was so young. She was like 6 to 8 months when I was starting to get on this journey. And I remember going to play dates, going to playgrounds, saying things to her that I had been learning from these courses. For example, like changing a diaper. So I would change my baby's diaper. And one thing I was learning was because they're a whole person, they should be treated like a whole person. If you were, let's say, an elderly person with a diaper in an old folks' home, and you were going to them and helping them change the diaper, you wouldn't just like rip it off and put one on, right? You would be like, okay, I'm here, I'm going to change your diaper. Here we go, I'm going to remove your pants now. And then you kind of like talk through the process because they deserve it. They're a whole person. But we don't do that to babies. And so I started trying to apply this and doing this with my baby. I'd be like, okay, I'm going to come and change your diaper now. Here's a wet wipe. It's going to be cold on your skin. I'm going to wipe now. And just kind of like talking her through it. She's like a 6-month-old little, baby lying on the changing mat. And I remember at playgrounds and at play dates, people would be like, complete strangers would be so flummoxed by why I was talking to a baby. And they would come up to me and be like, excuse me, I heard you say this earlier. Like, why are you talking to your baby like this? And then so I would explain like, oh, these are all the things I'm learning, that actually they understand us. They may not understand our words, but they understand our touch. They understand our tone of voice. They understand our facial expressions. And so it's actually great to communicate with them this way. And then people will be like, wow, that's so cool. Can you teach me all this stuff? And I'm like, no, I'm not teaching anything. I'm just learning it. Here are all the resources I've done, all the books I've read, all the podcasts I listen to, all the courses I've done. Go and do it too. And this was like, I think I had heard this for about a year and a bit. I would tell people this is how I'm learning this stuff. And they would be like, no, I don't have time. I don't have interest. I don't want to do all this stuff. Can you just teach me a condensed version? And so for the longest time through that whole year plus, I was just like, dude, I have nothing new to say. All of this stuff is there. The science is clear. Go read it yourself. And then I had my second child. So close to my daughter's 2-year birthday, I had my second child. And I was finding myself doing all of this from scratch again, from the beginning with a new baby. And I was just like, actually, I do have something to say. Because what I realized was everything that I was learning was very much anchored in a Western cultural experience. So the courses I was taking They were basically like, I mean, just to be very frank, it was Caucasian people teaching things for a Caucasian audience. And even if you weren't Caucasian, it was rooted in a very Western cultural experience. And so I realized that, there are many things you're teaching that are not super applicable to an Asian family. And I was like, I do have something to say. As I was trying to apply this in my life, I realized I was taking what they were teaching and tweaking it to be relevant to an Asian cultural context, to an Asian family structure, to an Asian parenting dynamic. And then I was like, okay, I do have something different to say. I do want to teach this because I don't think parents need to struggle so much with parenting. It doesn't need to be this fraught thing where you're always at war with your kid. And then I was like, okay, I will start my business. I will try this out. So I created a course at the beginning and I opened 30 spaces for it. And I didn't have a website. It was really, really just like bare bones. And all I did was like tell people on social media that I'm thinking of doing this thing. Would anyone be interested? And if you are, fill out this Google form. And so I then sent that email out to everyone to say, okay, I've launched my course. I have 30 spots as a pilot project test. Are you interested? Buy this thing. And then it sold out in in 3 hours. And like just a few hours, it just sold out. And I was like, whoa, okay, there's clearly something here. There is something about this that is resonating with people. Maybe this could really be a business. And so that's how I ended up starting Juicy Parenting.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a journey.
Again, it's a very long journey.
Yeah, but I mean, I can definitely see why, because like I'm pretty sure if there are any new parents out there, or even just experienced parents, if someone could come in to tell them how to parent, just tell them what to do, they would they would pay for that service. So I can definitely see why. Like, there's definitely a need for it. It's not even like they realize, oh, how wrong their parenting styles have been. It's just basically someone who's willing to tell them, maybe you can do it differently. Like, it does sound very compelling. And I mean, of course, you might have mentioned briefly, right? Because like a lot of the parenting courses or like knowledge that you have gotten over the stage of research, they are quite like Western centric. And also Asian parenting is arguably the most well-known parenting style in the world for a lot of wrong reasons. Like a lot of maybe Western, especially Western countries or Western parents, they would accuse the Asian parenting style of being too violent, too cruel. There are a lot of like negative stereotypes around it. So I'm just wondering, from your point of view, do you think these stereotypes are true?
As with any stereotype, there's always nuance. It is not going to be 100% true. I think, the whole tiger mom thing, tiger parent thing, that has become a fixation in people's minds, like, oh, this is how all Asian people parent. It's not necessarily true. I think there are kernels of truth in it, that Asian parenting can be quite violent. We do hit our kids. In many countries, in Canada where I'm at, it's against the law. You can't hit your kid. But it's not the case in Singapore. You can still hit your kids. Even in school, at a boys' school, the discipline master can still cane a kid, right? Like, it's unthinkable in many Western countries, but it's true that it is quite violent sometimes. I do think that people don't see enough the goodness of Asian parenting. So I think if people bothered to look beyond stereotypes and to understand the culture a bit better, people would realize that actually a lot of Asian parenting, while harsh and while violent, and I do not agree with that, is really rooted in this very deep sense of love. It really comes from this place of, I want you to have the best possible life. I want you to eclipse me and my accomplishments and all the things that I'm able to provide. And therefore, I need to be harsh on you so that you survive the real world, so that you go out and do all these great things. It is very much rooted in a place of like, I care about you so much. I want you to have a good life. That's why I'm going to do these things to you. So I don't agree with it, but I do think that people miss that point. People I think stereotypically that Asian parents are just, they lose control. They just want to like lash out at their kids. It's not true. I have not met a single parent who genuinely wants to hit their kid. I think often they feel that it's what they have to do. They see no other alternative. And they believe, look, everyone does this, everyone turns out fine, let's do it. So I don't really think that that stereotype is really true.
We can't really look at Asian parenting from a very like black and white lens as well, because like a little while ago I was talking to this Asian American family counselor who works in California, and then she was telling me about how some of the cases, the families that she worked with, it was all like a lot of times maybe non-Asian witnesses, or like teachers or like neighbors. They might see, oh, this Asian family, the parents actually hit their kids, so that's domestic violence, let's call the police on them. So this is happening a lot in Western countries, but of course I'm not saying they are not 100% domestic violence cases, but then sometimes we also need to look at it from like a non-black and white perspective, from that nuanced cultural perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, hitting a kid, that's black and white. Like, it's not okay. Like, you wouldn't hit your spouse, right? If you change the word kid to wife, I hit my wife because she misbehaved. No, that's battery. You're going to jail for that. For some reason, that's this double standard with the kids. For me, that's black and white. However, I do think that people do not see beyond the behavior, and they're not accepting that there's cultural nuance here and that it's important to understand before you start calling the cops on someone. And that is something I've heard before as well. It's interesting. So on Instagram, I often get DMs from people who are therapists. So they're non-Asian, but they're therapists and they sometimes serve Asian clients. And what's interesting is they will DM me to say that, like, it's hard to kind of counsel or provide therapy to these families because I don't understand the cultural nuance. And that's why they follow my page, not to get parenting tips, but to understand the cultural nuances behind why Asian parenting is as such. And I found that really interesting because I didn't start my page to reach out to therapists who are not Asian, right? I started it to reach out to Asian parents. But it's interesting finding the audience dynamics and like how different people with a different demographic come to learn about the context. I think that's really great. I think if people can just learn more and start from a place of understanding rather than judgment, then that can't be a bad thing, right? That's always a good thing.
Have you gotten any like observation around like why did Asian parents parent the way that they did?
It comes back to what we said earlier that, well, number one, love. It's just love harnessed in a very harsh way rather than the highest kind of love, which is like rooted in respect. But also just what was modeled to them before, right? What they saw and what they believe is important. In Mandarin, there's this phrase that people say like 不打不成才. Like if you don't hit your kid, they're not gonna amount to anything. And it's this deep belief that like if I don't hit my kid, if I am not harsh with them, they're not gonna be good people. They're gonna amount to nothing. And I think that fear driving parents is a very powerful fear, and it creates this sort of harsh parenting. And something that I've come to learn as a parent is that when you parent from a place of fear, like nothing good happens. Nothing good happens because you're fueled by what if something bad happens rather than being fueled by, I love this kid so much. Let's make this, let's give the runway, leave it open, let them explore, let them be who they truly are rather than who I project on them. I always think about how Asian parenting is so rooted in love and yet it's harnessed in a very harsh way, and what it could be if we harnessed it differently.
And of course, like you started your business, with the aim that there's a way for Asian parenting to move forward in a slightly kinder and, like more effective direction. So can you tell us more about, what might be some of the techniques that you will be teaching your clients?
So how I characterize my approach is respectful parenting. And a lot of times people are like, what the hell does that even mean? So respectful parenting, the reason I like the word respect is because I think it really speaks to an Asian cultural experience. Because if you think about respect in Asian culture is so important, right? The thing is though, respect in Asian cultures only goes one way, it goes up. So to people who are older, people with more authority, people who are higher in hierarchy, right? It only goes one way. And what I'm saying is respectful parenting in an Asian context is also about bringing respect down. So to people who are younger in age than you, who have less authority, who are lower in hierarchy, that's important too. Like I said, they are not, like little kids are not human beings in training. They're already human beings. They should be treated with that respect. And so I think that's one fundamental thing that's quite different. How that actually plays out is, I think Asian parents often are quite emotionally neglectful. So Asian parents are really great with providing physically, financially for their kids. Generally, Asian parents really try and do a lot of providing. But where that stops short is emotional provision. A lot of times, Asian parents are, whether because they're afraid of emotions themselves or whether because they believe emotions make you weak, they're very much like, repress your feelings. I don't want to hear about it. Stop crying. And you get punished for expressing yourself and all these feelings. So, like, happy feelings are okay. Happy feelings are good. We can express those. But negative feelings, difficult feelings like feeling sad or feeling angry or feeling frustrated, that's not okay. Like, silence it. I don't want to hear it. Be a good girl, be a good boy, don't cry. That kind of narrative. So that's one big thing that changes when I speak to clients. Like, the first, most fundamental thing people need to understand is that all feelings are okay. Feelings are just feelings, right? All feelings are okay. And there's a difference between a feeling and a behavior. So if a child is upset that someone else took his toy and then went to bite that other child, the feeling of being upset is okay. The behavior of biting the child is not. And so that's something that's really important to distinguish for parents, because a lot of times they hear, oh, respectful parenting, I respect my kids, so that means they can just do whatever they want. They run the show. I'm like, no. That's permissive parenting. We don't want to do that either. We don't want to be super harsh. We don't want to be permissive either. We want to be somewhere in the happy middle, which is where you are an authority, you're a leader for your child, and you are showing them that, hey, this behavior is not okay. However, your feelings, who you are, how you're expressing yourself, that is okay. I am here for you with that. I'm not asking you to shut down who you are and be a good child and be like, oh, someone took my toy, no big deal, I'm fine. Like, no, you are allowed to have emotions, and I will help you process those emotions. And I think what's really powerful about this is when we tell Asian kids, shut up, stop crying, children should be seen and not heard, we kind of deprive them of an opportunity for them to work through feelings and to understand that I can deal with this devastation that someone else took my toy. I can feel those feelings and I will move through it. I will not always feel this bad. With the support of my loving parent, I will move through this feeling. I will find a different way to move forward. But when we tell our kids, stop crying, nothing to be upset about, someone only took your toy, no big deal, here, I have this other toy instead, we basically kind of short circuit that, right? We divert it. And instead of moving through the hard feeling, they have now learned, oh, I'm just going to find a way to divert every time. And then that's how we become adults who, when something, unhappy, unfortunate happens, we're like, okay, I'm just going to buy some bag, or I'm just going to eat my feelings to distract myself away from this emotion that has become so intolerable for me to feel. And I think every time we send our kids that message that oh, feelings are not okay, shut it down, move on, we're basically not teaching them and not supporting them in learning how to work through these feelings. And I think that's the really sad part about Asian parenting, that I don't know about you, but I feel that Asian parents, if they knew what to do, they would be unstoppable because they are so loyal to family. They provide amazingly for their kids. If they could just add that emotional provision, man, your kids would be amazing, unstoppable, so resilient all around.
I know. Yes. I mean, the Asian parents traditionally, they get the kids to make sure they go to good schools, go to Yale. And also, I mean, I agree. If they were able to take care of that emotional factor, then Asian children would be Superman, Superwomen. Everyone would be that. But I can definitely agree with you about how Asian parents, they are so reluctant to tackle that emotional side of things, especially when negative emotions arise. They would see it as a negative thing. The kids would get penalized for having negative emotions. And I can see how that could also be manifested in adulthood, where a lot of these Asian adults, whether in the workplace, in relationships, or in friendships, or in social circles, they would be so reluctant to kind of have disagreement with anyone. Or first of all, they would be afraid to disagree, and people who are disagreed with, they would get so offended. But to be honest, like I think the way to move forward to improve this is really just to normalize, like feeling negative emotions, normalize disagreement, knowing that disagreement does not mean someone is trying to take you down. But I think there's a long way to go, like in a lot of like Asian countries and cultures for this, because like I do understand that for Asian cultures, they are all for that whole collectivism and also harmony, right? So disagreement has no place in their cultures, basically.
Yeah, I really do think it's hard because, Asian parents often they think about like, oh, I want my kid to be able to take risks and to make mistakes and to, I want them to be resilient. But at the end of the day, if we keep raising kids to don't talk back, never disagree with me, then how are they supposed to be able to advocate for themselves? How are they supposed to be able to make a mistake and move on from that? Because otherwise, they're just thinking, oh, I've made a mistake, devastating. Make sure I hide it from my parents so they never know. Like when you're really harsh to your kids, you're not really teaching them anything apart from hide your mistakes better next time. Because if mom finds out, there's hell to pay. But how are they supposed to then tell you they've made a mistake? How are they supposed to be their authentic selves with you and share what's going on in their lives if all they've known is if mom finds out, she's going to lose her shit, I'm going to get caned, not good. It's hard. And if we extrapolate that, the things that we prize in adults, speaking up for yourself, advocating for others, we don't prize in childhood. But how are kids supposed to learn how to do all those great things later in life if they're not practicing it now?
Exactly.
And so as a parent, I see my responsibility as you are allowed to disagree with me. What we will work on is how you express that disagreement. Are you expressing it respectfully? Are you not? And then let's work on building those skills rather than immediately seeing a kid who talks back as like, you're naughty, you're disobedient, go to your room. Then we short circuit it. We don't have the time, we don't have the opportunity to talk about how to do things differently next time. So yeah, it's hard. I always think about how, we want our kids to be XYZ when they're older. And if we want that XYZ has to happen when they're younger too, so that they can practice and find ways to express themselves appropriately so that when they get into adulthood, they know how to do it, rather than what we have now, which is a whole generation of kids who just suppress all their feelings, who suppress their pissiness at work with a coworker or boss.
Yeah.
They feel the feelings, but they don't know what to do about it, right? And so they just repress it and they get more and more angry, and it's just not helpful for anybody.
Yeah. I mean, like for our generations, we're just kind of like starting to learn how to reparent ourselves and unlearn some of the toxic traits that we might have picked up along the way. But of course, like these days, we also talk a lot about that, right? Like childhood trauma, how that can be manifested into, the daily lives of an adult, and how parents actually played a big part in someone's childhood trauma. But I mean, in a way, it's getting a lot of like new parents anxious as well, because obviously they'll be like, I don't want to traumatize my kids. So now they're kind of like walking on eggshells, when it comes to like parenting kids. But I'm just wondering, like, how careful should they be? So they wouldn't really risk being way too careful, right? Because like obviously we don't want to traumatize the children, but at the same time, there are some pain or maybe trauma or like difficulties or hardship that they have to go through to build their own characters as well, right?
Yeah, I think it's a great and important question because, as you said, sometimes parents swing the other way. And I see it in my clients. A lot of people are like really permissive, or they're really worried about making a misstep, and then so they kind of freeze. And I think it's important that parents realize, I say this to all my clients, you are a human, not a robot. It is important to know you will make mistakes. You are going to mess up somewhere, right? And it is okay. It is okay for your kid to see that you are human. What is really important is that you provide a safe space for your kids to land. So when you do make these mistakes, you take ownership, you have accountability, and you apologize. Something our parents never did. Unthinkable. Our parents are not going to apologize. We can be a generation that's different. And it's also really important to know that, our kids will go out into a harsh and cruel world. Sometimes it's harsh and cruel, not always. But things will happen, right? And we can't pave a way that's going to be perfectly smooth. In fact, it would be doing them a disservice because that's not how the world works. It's important that they understand that yes, the world will give you some setbacks sometimes. And the key here is to make sure that when those setbacks happen, because of how you've parented, because you've respected them from the beginning, you've created an emotionally safe space for them, they know that when that happens, they can come back home and home will always be a safe space. Because we can't control the world, right? The world's going to do whatever it does, and our kids are going to be thrust into that world and they will meet whatever vagaries will happen. However, what we can control is the environment we create at home so that when something, and not if, when something bad does happen out there, they know they can always come back and tell us the truth of what happened. And that's the only way we have a fighting chance of helping to support them. But if you think about how a lot of our generation does it, something bad happens out there. Well, we learn that if we tell our parents, nothing's good going to come out of that because we might be blamed, we might be shamed for it. You know, like there's many heartbreaking stories I have of people telling me, you know, I was molested as a kid. And when I told my mom said, well, who asked you to have such big breasts? Like, just completely placing the blame on the child and completely illogically. Or even it doesn't even have to be anything, you know, quite so heartbreaking. It could be something like, you know, today I got scolded by a teacher. And then it's like, well, what do you do? And it's immediately this idea of you are at fault for something that happened. And I'm not saying that's not true. Obviously, in the molest case, that's definitely not true. But instead of first seeking to understand and connect, Asian parenting is very much like, I'm going to blame you, I'm going to shame you first. And instead of trying to understand, okay, tell me what happened and how did this all evolve, and let me support you through those feelings so you know you're not alone in them. I think if we can raise our kids that way, then they know that when something does happen, okay, my relationship with my parents, the history has taught me that they don't freak out. They are there for me. They don't default to seeing the worst in me. They actually are interested in my point of view. Then they know, okay, this bad thing happened, I can come back and tell them, you know. And I think a lot of times the word trauma, they're really worried about that, I'm going to traumatize my kid. And what's really important to know is that trauma doesn't happen because this thing happened to you, right? It's that your experience of it, you felt really alone in it. You couldn't turn to someone. You didn't have any support to help you process that. With our kids, when something bad happens, hey, you can come back. I will help you. I will be with you. I can't solve it for you. This is your life to lead. I'm talking like an adult child, right? I can't solve it for you, but you can always come back to me. And I will always walk alongside you. I think that's so powerful in showing a kid, yes, your life is yours to lead. I can't change your problems. I can listen without judgment. We can brainstorm. If you would like my opinion, we can brainstorm together. And how important it is to build a relationship now when our kids are young, so that when they become teenagers, when the stakes are much higher, there is a safe space to land in. So that's something I think about a lot. Like I tell all my clients, like think about your kid at 18. If you have a daughter, like think about they've been drinking all night with their friends and now someone wants to give them a ride home and that person has been drinking too. And you know, if you have set up an emotionally connected relationship with your child, I want my kid to know that the safest ride you'll have that night is me. So call me, because I will pick you up from the bar instead of you jumping into this drunk driver's car, which is devastating, right? That could have devastating consequences. Just call me. Am I going to be a little bit pissed? Am I going to be questioning your judgment and getting that pissed drunk at 3 a.m? And am I going to be pissed that, I had to get out of bed to do this? Yeah, I will be, because I'm human and my feelings are okay too. And I want you to know that it's okay to call me. Like, I will be your ride home. I will be your safest ride home. Don't go and jump into some drunkard's car, because you are worried about what I will say. And I think it's so important that if that's what we want, if that's a relationship we want with our kids later, that starts now. That starts with every glass of water they spill, every drawing on the wall that they make. How do we react? Do we freak out? Or do we show them a different way forward in a very calm way? I think it really all starts now.
That is very powerful. It almost feels like, that way is kind of like cultivating some sort of like friendship with the children as well. Like it's a safe space for them. And like you mentioned, like always keeping that door open for your kids is so important, because a lot of times like people or adults who struggle with like mental health challenges, a lot of tragedies happen because of loneliness, because people think that they have nowhere to go. And to have maybe family members or parents always keeping that door open, it's so powerful. And before we move on to the next segment, I'm also curious, like if it's possible for, like Asian adults like us to sort of like reverse that dynamics with our Asian parents. Is it even possible to reparent our parents?
Okay, so one thing that I really try and tell my clients is that you are not your child's best friend. You may want to be. You are not. Parenting, there's this guy called Gabor Mate. I love him. He has such great things to say about parenting. He talks about how parenting is not a democracy. There is a hierarchy involved, and for good reason, right? A baby doesn't get to crawl out in the snow and be like, yeah, I would like to be in the snow today. No, you are a parent. You have more knowledge, you have more experience. For many things, you do know better than your child, and it is your responsibility to have boundaries in place. However, the part of the friendship is that emotional connection where it's like, you can tell me anything. And at the same time, when you tell me these things, I am your parent. I am in charge. I am in charge of your safety, at least until you turn whatever age you decide they're an adult. And I think it's important for parents to learn, to know that just because you are parenting respectfully, it doesn't mean you are now their best friend. It is important that you understand you are still their parent. It is still your responsibility to create boundaries that are good for your child. The question is, how do you create those boundaries? Do you do so in a very harsh way by being very cruel? Or do you set it in place by explaining, okay, this is what it is. This is how it goes. And yes, I get it. It's hard for you. And you don't like that I said that you can't have a cookie for dinner. You can't crawl out in the snow in your underwear. I get it. You can be upset about that. And this is still what's happening. Rather than the typical Asian way, which is like, don't talk back to me. You don't know anything. No cookie for you. Why are you always so bad? Like that kind of very negative, I see the worst in you parenting. So yeah, I just wanted to make that point that like, we are not our kids as friends. we are their parent at the end of the day. As for how and whether we can reparent our parents, I think that it is definitely possible to have a different relationship going forward if the other party is also open to it. If they are not, I would tell people, don't waste your emotional energy trying to change the dynamic with your parents, because it's really not your responsibility, number one. It is also not possible. You're going to be fighting a losing battle because everyone is in charge of their own actions. And everyone is in charge of whether they take accountability for those actions. We cannot compel someone else to be like, well, you need to now change. You hurt me these ways in the past. You need to acknowledge it and change so that we are better. If we set up that dynamic, we're never going to be happy because our happiness is tied to how someone else behaves. And that's literally the worst place we can put ourselves. We have no control over that. That's really, really defeating. We will feel like, oh gosh, nothing's ever going to change. So what I would say is put your energies into reparenting yourself. Reparent your inner child. Reparent yourself so that how you then relate to your parents is different. For example, if in your family you were always the doormat and you always just did everything your parents asked you to do, but inside you were secretly resentful and boiling, it is within your power to change that dynamic. So as much as you may be wishing for your parents not to place these ideas and expectations on you, realizing that you are not in control of that, they are, can be really helpful, because you realize, okay, I'm not going to sit here and wait for people to change things for me. I am an adult now. I am in charge. I get to decide how I show up in my family dynamic. So if you no longer want to be the people pleaser, you don't have to be. And that is uncomfortable, and that will take adjusting. And that's why I'm a big fan of therapy and seeing a counselor or therapist and working out your stuff and realizing what you are and are not responsible for. I think it's so liberating when we realize, okay, however my parents behaved, that's on them. That's not on me. I don't have to continually be in this role anymore. I can change and I can be something different. And I think we have to be ready for that discomfort, because there will be friction. Anytime we disrupt something, a pattern that has been laid out, anytime we disrupt that and something different arises, we have to be comfortable that, okay, I'm going to be different, knowing that the outcome's going to be different and it's going to be uncomfortable. And I can do this. If I'm not happy with what has been happening, I can do it. I'm an adult now. I don't have to do things the way it's always been done. So I really think instead of focusing on how can we reparent our parents, let's focus on reparenting ourselves so that we can show up differently in our family dynamics.
Yes, it's always important. Or, I mean, like, if anything, start practicing. It takes a lot of practice to kind of like set our own boundaries, even around our family members, and also communicate our boundaries respectively. And like you said, how they react or how they behave around those boundaries, it's really not our responsibility. But then our responsibility is to just make sure that the boundaries are communicated, are set in a respectful manner. So thank you so much for sharing all those tips with us. But now it's time for us to move on to the next segment, which is called Rapid Bias. And in this segment, I'll be asking my guests bias questions that they've got asked at some points in life. And in Kelly's case, common misconceptions people have about parenting. So Kelly, are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Yes, and the first question is, so are you saying Western parenting is better?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. We're not going to get into an argument about Western versus Asian parenting, which is better. It's not fruitful. Let's just focus on what can we take from Asian parenting that is great, and what needs to change about Asian parenting that we can do differently. And let's marry those two together and create a new baby. Let's create a new, wonderful, modern Asian parenting way that is very steeped in Asian cultural values and that we can create that is different from anything that's out there. We don't have to just take what Western parenting is and adopt it wholesale. That's not going to work. Let's create our own and let's make it completely different from what it was before while still holding on to what was great about what came before.
Love it. Love it. Charting a new path here for all parents around the world. And the second question is, I would never take parenting advice from an Asian.
This is a true story, by the way. Someone really did say that to me. Yeah. Because I started running ads for my business, and some random grandmother in Louisiana was like, I would never take parenting advice from an Asian. Verbatim. And basically what I said was, that's fine. I'm not for everybody. And I hope that your grandchildren break these toxic cycles of making, broad brushstroke ideas of what an entire culture is like. And I hope that your grandchildren no longer think this way about other people and they stop making snap judgments about a whole continent of people.
Absolutely. Moving on to the third question. Oh, you're from Singapore. That's in China, right?
I mean,
oh dear.
It's a 6.5-hour flight away. It's definitely not in Singapore, and we have lots more other races than Chinese in Singapore.
Yeah. It's a completely different country, everyone, in case you didn't know. And finally, wow, your English is so good. The classic bias question.
I would just say talk to my husband. He is Caucasian and he will readily tell you that I speak and write better English than him. It's possible, people.
Amazing. Thank you so much for answering all these fiery questions in this segment of Rapid Bias, Kelly.
Thank you, Isabel.
And now for us to wrap up the episode, I mean, I know before we started recording, you mentioned that now you're raising, obviously, two beautiful mixed race kids. So I'm also curious, like, have you ever, had disagreement with your husband about like how to parent? Because obviously he is Caucasian Canadian, and he obviously grew up with a more Western style of parenting, and you coming from Asia. Like, have you guys ever had disagreement about that?
Yeah, I think we've had many, many deep discussions about this simply because our parenting backgrounds are so different. We're from two completely different worlds. And I think we've always agreed, like, definitely, no hitting our kids. I think what has been interesting with him is discussing things about emotions. So even though Western parenting is often seen as like more accepting of kids, actually, there's still a lot there that needs to change, particularly with emotions. So I don't think it's just a Western parenting thing, it's that all families are often uncomfortable with emotions. And so it's very much like, don't pull a long face, turn that frown upside down. Like those are the phrases that he grew up with. And when I was starting to learn this stuff and talking about like emotions, actually all of them are okay. They will pass. We can help our kids process. At first, there was this feeling of like, no, but you can't have this like soft kid, raising kids this way will make them very soft. Emotions are soft. And it was definitely something we had to talk through quite a bit to think about what is our cultural baggage around the word emotions or softness, and then how do we move through that. And so I think we haven't had like major disagreements, but definitely culturally some things about like, oh, this seems a little bit weird, it butts up against my like, no, we have to be stoic, this is how we push through things. Those kinds of things we've definitely had questions about. And I think like one major thing we definitely chat about a lot, and I don't know that we have all the answers to, is how do we raise mixed race kids, in because neither of us are mixed race. Well, I'm like Chinese and Malay, but we're kind of seen as like homogenous Peranakan. I don't think either of us has fully figured this out, but I think we have come back to our values and being like, we just want to be a safe space for our kids. So how can we model that and be that every day with this mixed race thing in the back of our heads? And one thing that we learned recently was it's really nice to, instead of telling mixed race kids, you are half Singaporean, half Canadian, which makes them feel split, right?
Mm-hmm.
Someone who is mixed race told us this, that actually what can really help is telling your kids, you are 100% Singaporean and you are 100% Canadian. So instead of feeling like you are half of half and never quite being whole and never quite being either, actually you are fully this and you are also fully that. And I think that has really been quite helpful for me, thinking of how we show up for our kids, how we talk about where you're from. Especially, every summer we take a few months to live in Canada so that we can be with the in-laws, they can experience Canada. It's all part of this effort to make sure that they know they are from these places. It is as much yours as it is the person who is 100% Canadian. And I think this 100% thing has been very helpful for me because I definitely saw things as like half half before.
Mm.
Even the nickname for kids who are from different places, you're like halfies, right? Like you're half this. And so now I've
Yeah.
like stopped using that because I'm trying not to talk about things in like fractions, more in like wholeness.
That is beautiful. Yeah, to be able to feel enough, at least in their own family, because I definitely on Proudly Asian, a lot of our guests are either mixed race or like multicultural. So a lot of times wherever they go, they will be defined by either the way that they look, the languages that they speak, wherever they go, they never really feel quite enough. And to have that mindset of being 100% of everything that they are is so powerful. So once again, thank you so much for sharing all these tips with us, Kelly. And before we go, just have two final questions for you. For those who would like to continue to follow your journey, your advice, your tips, where can they find you online?
Yeah, so on Instagram, I am juicy.parenting.
Mm.
And then online, just juicyparenting.com. I have a newsletter, like 3 emails go out a week, and I promise they're not boring because I'm a journalist. I have a background in writing. I promise I write well. I take pride. I love those newsletters actually. Um, Something interesting is I have a children's picture book coming up that's going to
Mm.
be published in November, and
Wow.
the idea behind this book, actually, Isabel, you're like the first person I've told publicly.
Oh my God. You hear
Breaking
it
news.
fast here.
So the whole idea of it is, you know, there are really outdated things that people say to Asian kids from an Asian cultural experience, right? Like Asian parents often say, we've talked about some of them, like, don't cry, or like, why can't you be more like her? Finish up all your food, like, stuff like that. And the idea of the book is I'm taking all the things that Asian kids hear from the world and what we as parents who are doing things differently believe instead. So the book is called The World May Say This, but I Believe That. And it's basically a book of the dichotomies between what the world may tell you and what I, as your parent, actually believe. And I created the book because I really think the constant thing I keep hearing from parents is like, I want to parent differently. I just don't know how. I don't know where to start. And I think having a picture book that you can read with your kids that has the words for you to say what to say otherwise, like there's a page about talking back, right? Like the world may say, don't talk back. And on the other side, I'm giving the parents the words to say instead. So like, I believe your voice is important and I will teach you, I will help you learn how to use it respectfully, right? Like giving parents the actual words they can say to their kids as they read this book. And what I really like is the illustrator, she's Singaporean, and we're really trying to root the illustrations in an Asian experience so that kids see themselves in the book. You know, they hear the words that the world keeps telling them, it feels familiar, but like they're rewriting a new story with their parents every time they read this book. So that's something that I'm really excited about. It comes out in November.
Yay.
So, yeah.
I feel like this is a children's book, not just for children, not just for parents, but for every adult. Like we all have to learn how to reframe, a lot of these like negative self-talks.
Yes, 100%. You know, when I was writing it, so it's one thing to put the text on paper. It's another thing to see what the illustrator comes back with. When she shares with me the drafts, there's this page about feelings and how people say, don't cry, right? And the illustration she did, honestly, I read it, I started crying. I was like, it's so healing for me to like see that, like, I just imagine a parent reading this to their kid and the kind of impact it would have for a kid to know it's okay to cry. I am here with you as you cry, like that. I saw it with the picture. I was like, so I do agree with you that it's for adults as well, for Asian adults.
I can't wait to see it being released in November. And finally, one last question, Kelly.
Sure.
We'll let you go back to your kids after this question.
I love that they haven't run in.
I know, they are so patient. Thank you so much. Finally, what does it mean to be proudly Asian to you?
Oh man, I think we've touched on it, that Asian parenting does not have to be this negative stereotype. I am proudly Asian. I'm like a proudly Asian mother doing things differently that is still very, very much Asian, still very rooted in my cultural values and my heritage. And I'm proud of it. I'm proud that we can do something differently. That it's what proudly Asian means to me. Like as a mother, as a parent, I think it's so great to be able to say, no, I'm not just taking what Western parents are saying wholesale. I'm just taking the science of what psychologists say, what neuroscientists say, and applying that in an Asian context and creating something that is our own for us. That's like so empowering for me.
Amazing. It's one thing to be proudly Asian, but it's also another beautiful journey to become a proudly Asian mother. So thank you so much for sharing, the wisdom, the journey that you have gone through to come this far, Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I really want to thank you for your podcast too, because I think these conversations are important. It's hard to talk about, right? A lot of times Asian people don't want to talk about these things. So thank you.
We're here to have that difficult parenting conversation. Thank you for joining us for that.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Proudly Asian. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at proudly.asian for more content. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Leave us a 5-star review on wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and signing off for now. I'm Isabel Wong.